There are places in America where things don't follow the rules, where the wilderness is so thick, so untouched, that it's held onto secrets since before we even had a country. Jake Miller didn't believe in any of that supernatural stuff. Past tense, didn't. Because what happened in the Wind River Range turned a skeptic into, well, you'll see. The smell hit him first. That's the thing nobody tells you about encounters with the unknown. It's not the sight that gets you, it's the smell. That sweet rotten stench that makes your stomach turn and your instincts scream danger at a frequency only your lizard brain can hear. Jake Miller was checking his moonshine still when he found those tracks, 18 inches long, pressed deep into the Wyoming mud, like whatever made them weighed as much as a small car. 5 toes, just like a human foot, only 3 times the size. That's when Jake knew his illegal operation had attracted something that wasn't supposed to exist. Now, I know what you're thinking. Bigfoot? Really? Come on. And look, I get it. But here's the thing. Jake had been running corn liquor through a hidden still in these mountains for 8 years. 8 years of dealing with grizzlies, mountain lions, federal agents, and winters that dropped to 40 below. The man knew the difference between bear tracks and something else. And this was definitely something else. Jake had the perfect location for his operation. Natural spring water, dense pine cover, and a series of caves that masked the smoke from his distilling. The nearest town was 37 miles of rough terrain away. No trails, no roads, just wilderness that most folks wouldn't dare navigate without a guide. He'd been working this spot for 3 years, by fall 2019, and in all that time, nothing had bothered him except the occasional black bear looking for an easy meal. Then September rolled around, and everything changed. Before I get into what happened next, do me a favor, if you're into these kinds of stories, real encounters with things that shouldn't exist, hit that subscribe button. I've got a whole collection of cases that'll make you rethink what's out there in America's wild places. And trust me, after you hear what happened to Jake, you're gonna want to stick around for the others. Drop a like if you're already hooked. And let me know in the comments, would you have stayed or run? Because Jake made a choice that night, and it changed everything. Alright, so let's get into it. Jake had left a batch of mash fermenting while he made a supply run to town. Takes about 5 days for a good ferment in those temperatures. When he came back, his camp looked wrong. Nothing he could put his finger on at first. Everything was where he'd left it. His tent, his equipment, the still itself. But it felt disturbed, like someone had been examining his setup without touching anything. You know that feeling when you come home and you just know someone's been in your space, even though nothing's moved? Yeah, that. Then he saw the prints around his fire pit, not bear tracks. Jake had seen plenty of those over the years. These were different, humanoid, but massive. The stride length was impossible for any person. Nearly 6 feet between steps. Whatever made them had walked straight through his camp, stopped at the still like it was considering the equipment, then continued into the forest. Jake thought about packing up right then. He should have dismantled everything and found a new location. But he had 12 gallons of premium shine ready to bottle and buyers waiting. The kind of buyers who don't appreciate delays and who might break your kneecaps if you make them look bad to their customers. So he stayed, loaded his rifle, and tried to convince himself it was some kind of hoax. Maybe another moonshiner trying to scare him off the territory. That night, he heard the wood knocks. 3 deliberate strikes against a tree maybe 200 yards from camp. The sound echoed through the valley like thunder. Jake had heard woodpeckers. He'd heard branches falling. He'd heard all the normal forest sounds you get in the Rockies. This was different. This had intent behind it. Purpose. Like someone was sending a signal. He didn't sleep. Just sat there with his back against a boulder, rifle across his lap, watching the tree line. Around 3 in the morning, he saw eye shine at the edge of his firelight. Too high to be a wolf. Too steady to be an owl. Whatever it was, stood there for 20 minutes, just watching. Jake's hands shook on his rifle, but something stopped him from firing. Maybe it was the intelligence in that gaze. Maybe it was fear. Hell, Maybe it was both. Then it was gone, melting back into the darkness without a sound. The next morning, Jake found where it had been standing. More tracks, and the ground was compressed like something heavy had been shifting its weight back and forth. There were broken branches 9 feet up, where it had been holding onto the trees for support. 9 feet tall. What in creation stands 9 feet tall and walks on 2 legs? Jake had a decision to make. Pack up and lose everything he'd built, or stay and risk another encounter. The smart money was on leaving, but Jake wasn't smart. He was stubborn. This was his territory, his operation. He'd dealt with claim jumpers, federal raids, and every predator the Rockies could throw at him. He wasn't about to let some overgrown ape run him off, so he adapted, started leaving food scraps at the edge of camp. Nothing fancy, just leftovers from his meals. Beans, cornbread, dried meat. Every morning, the food was gone. No mess, no scattered remains like you'd see with bears or coyotes. Just gone. And those massive tracks leading away into the forest. Thing is, Jake had learned something important during his years in the wilderness. Everything's looking for an easy meal. Bears, mountain lions, even humans. We're all just trying to survive. And if this creature wanted to hurt him, it had plenty of opportunities. Instead, it was taking his offerings and leaving him alone. That suggested intelligence, reasoning, maybe even gratitude. After 2 weeks of this routine, something extraordinary happened. Jake was tending the still one evening, adjusting the temperature on the condenser. It was delicate work, the kind that required your full attention because 1 degree too hot and you'd ruin the whole batch. He was focused on the thermometer when he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Each step pressed into the ground with a weight that Jake could feel through his boots. His rifle was leaning against a tree 20 feet away. Might as well have been 20 miles. He turned around real slow, hands visible, trying not to make any sudden movements. And there it was. 9 feet of muscle and dark brown hair, standing at the edge of his camp like it belonged there, like it owned the place. The face was almost human, but not quite. Broader, with deep-set eyes that reflected the firelight like an animal's. The smell was overwhelming. Wet dog, mixed with something earthier, more primal. Something that made Jake's hindbrain scream predator. They stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 seconds. Jake's heart hammered in his chest so hard, he thought it might crack a rib. His mouth went dry. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he knew that would be the worst thing he could do. You don't run from predators. Then Jake did something that surprised them both. He spoke to it. Easy there, big fellow. I'm not looking for trouble. The creature tilted its head, processing the sounds. Its nostrils flared, probably taking in Jake's scent, categorizing him as threat or not threat. Jake could see the intelligence working behind those eyes. This wasn't some dumb animal. This thing was thinking. Then it did something that changed everything. It sat down. Just plopped down on its haunches like a person settling in for a conversation, though it still towered over Jake even sitting. The movement was so casual, so human, that Jake almost laughed. Almost. Hard to laugh when your legs feel like water and you're pretty sure you're about to piss yourself. But the creature didn't seem aggressive. If anything, it looked curious. Jake kept talking. Nonsense, mostly. Told it about the still, about the weather, about anything that came to mind. His voice seemed to calm it, or maybe it was amusing itself with the strange little human making noise. Either way, it stayed for an hour, just listening, occasionally tilting its head when Jake changed topics. When it finally stood to leave, it paused at the pile of scraps Jake had left out. Instead of taking them immediately, it looked back at Jake, then at the food, then back at Jake again, like it was asking permission. Jake nodded. The creature gathered up the scraps with surprisingly delicate movements for something with hands that could probably crush a bowling ball, then disappeared into the darkness. That became their routine. Every few nights, it would appear at the edge of camp. Jake would talk. It would listen. Then it would take the food and leave. Jake started calling it Moses. Don't ask him why. The name just felt right for something that appeared and disappeared like a biblical mystery. Like something out of the Old Testament wandering the wilderness. After a month, Moses started getting bolder. He'd come closer to the fire, sometimes sitting just 10 feet away. Jake could see the details then. The hair wasn't uniform like a bear's. It was longer on the arms and shoulders, shorter on the face and chest. The hands were massive, but perfectly proportioned, with opposable thumbs and fingernails, not claws. The feet were exactly what had made those tracks, wide and flat with an arch that suggested bipedal evolution. Millions of years of walking upright, but it was the intelligence in those eyes that really got Jake. This wasn't some animal operating on instinct. Moses was thinking, evaluating, learning. He started recognizing patterns in Jake's routine. On bottling days, he'd show up just as Jake finished, knowing Jake would be tired and stationary. On mash days, he'd keep his distance, understanding the process required Jake's full attention. The creature had learned Jake's schedule better than some of Jake's human friends ever had. Then came the night that proved just how smart Moses really was. Jake was dead asleep when something woke him. Not a sound exactly, more like a presence. You know that feeling when someone's watching you and you just know it, even with your eyes closed. He opened his eyes to find Moses standing over him, one massive hand held up in what looked like a stopping gesture. Before Jake could react, Moses pointed toward the trail leading down from the ridge. That's when Jake heard them. Voices, still distant, but getting closer. Federal agents, had to be. Nobody else would be hiking these trails at 2 in the morning with flashlights and radios crackling. Jake's blood went cold. They'd finally found him. Moses looked at Jake, then at the still, then back at Jake. The meaning was clear. He understood what would happen if they found Jake's operation. He'd seen enough to know that other humans were a threat to Jake, and by extension, to their arrangement. Jake jumped up and started breaking down the critical parts of the still, the condenser, the copper coil, anything that would immediately identify it as moonshine equipment. His hands shook as he worked, adrenaline making him clumsy. Every noise seemed too loud, every second stretched like taffy. Moses watched for a moment, his head tilted in that curious way. Then he did something that still gave Jake chills when he thought about it later. He started helping. Moses picked up 2 50-pound bags of corn mash, like they were pillows, and carried them into the cave. Then he came back for the fermenting barrels, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something that size. They worked in complete silence, Moses following Jake's lead, anticipating what needed to be moved next. It was like working with a partner who could read his mind. In 15 minutes, they'd hidden every trace of the operation. Then Moses did something even more remarkable. He walked to the trail the agents would be coming from and started breaking branches, disturbing the ground, creating false paths that led away from Jake's camp. He was laying down decoy trails, understanding not just that Jake needed to hide, but how human trackers work, how they think, how they follow signs. This creature understood human psychology. Jake grabbed his camping gear and made the site look like a regular backpacker's camp. Sleeping bag, portable stove, some canned food. Just a guy enjoying the wilderness, nothing suspicious. Moses vanished into the forest, but Jake could feel him watching, a presence in the darkness that was somehow reassuring instead of terrifying. 20 minutes later, 3 ATF agents walked into Jake's camp, flashlights blazing, hands resting on their weapons like they expected trouble. Federal agents, one announced. Like Jake couldn't see the giant letters on his jacket. We're investigating reports of illegal distillery operations in this area. Jake played the confused hiker, rubbing his eyes and asking what this was about. They searched the camp thoroughly, found nothing but standard camping equipment and some beef jerky. One of them noticed the tracks Moses had left earlier, and his whole demeanor changed. The cocky federal agent attitude vanished, replaced by something Jake recognized. Fear. You seen any bears around here? The agent asked, though his voice suggested he knew damn well those weren't bear tracks. No, sir, Jake replied. But something big came through yesterday. Didn't get a good look at it. The agents exchanged glances, and Jake saw it in their faces. These weren't local boys. They didn't know these mountains, but they knew enough to recognize that those tracks belonged to something they didn't want to meet in the dark. Something that was probably still out there, watching. They left within the hour, making excuses about covering more ground before dawn. As their voices faded down the trail, Moses emerged from the forest. He walked straight to the cave and started bringing Jake's equipment back out. Not randomly, but placing everything exactly where it had been before. He'd memorized the entire layout of the operation. That's when Jake realized this wasn't just some primitive creature living in the woods. Moses had complex reasoning abilities. He understood law enforcement, concealment, misdirection. He'd protected Jake's operation not because he cared about moonshine, but because he'd recognized the mutual benefit of their arrangement. Jake provided food. Moses provided security. It was a partnership, a friendship even. The relationship evolved from there. Moses started bringing Jake things. First, it was firewood, perfect pieces, already dried and cut to length. Jake would wake up to find a neat stack beside his fire pit, those massive tracks the only sign of Moses' visit. Then Moses started bringing pine cones and kindling, somehow understanding that Jake needed different materials for different types of fires. Jake increased the food offerings in return, started cooking extra portions specifically for Moses, found out he loved cornbread with honey, would practically purr when eating it. That's right, this 9-foot creature made a sound like a giant cat, a deep rumbling from his chest that was nothing like any vocalization Jake had heard from known animals. Winter was approaching, and Jake worried about Moses. The snows in Wyoming can be brutal, and Jake didn't know if Moses had adequate shelter. One evening, he tried to communicate this. He pointed at the sky, made shivering gestures, pointed at the caves. Moses seemed to understand, but shook his head. Then he stood and gestured for Jake to follow him. Jake grabbed his rifle and flashlight, though Moses moved through the darkness like he had built-in night vision. They hiked for about a mile up steep terrain Jake would have struggled with in daylight. Moses would pause occasionally, looking back to make sure Jake was keeping up, sometimes reaching out to steady him on particularly treacherous sections. Those hands could have crushed Jake's skull, but the touch was gentle, careful. Moses led him to a cave system Jake had never seen before. The entrance was hidden behind a fall of rocks that looked natural, but had definitely been arranged, camouflage. Inside, the cave was warm, not just warmer than outside, but genuinely warm, like someone had a heater running. Moses had found a geothermal vent and built his shelter around it. The cave was organized, areas for sleeping, eating, and what looked like tool storage. Yes, tools. Stones that had been shaped for specific purposes. Sticks fashioned into digging implements. Moses wasn't just intelligent, he was a tool user, a creator, a being with culture and practical knowledge. He showed Jake around like a proud homeowner, demonstrating how he'd diverted water from an underground stream into a natural basin, how he'd arranged rocks to maximize the heat from the thermal vent. There were bones in one corner, picked clean and sorted by size. Some were clearly from deer and elk, but others were from bears. Moses was an apex predator who could take down a grizzly, but what struck Jake most were the walls. They were covered in markings, not quite writing, but intentional patterns scraped into the rock. Some seemed representational, showing trees, mountains, animals. Others were more abstract, possibly counting systems or calendars. Moses had been documenting his world, recording his history. Moses led Jake to one section and pointed at a marking, then at Jake, then at the marking again. It was crude but recognizable, a representation of Jake's still. Moses had drawn Jake's operation into his history. Jake was part of his story now, just as Moses had become part of Jake's. The walk back to camp was quiet, but it was a comfortable quiet. They'd crossed some invisible line from tolerance to trust. Moses didn't just accept Jake's presence in his territory, he'd welcomed Jake into his world, and Jake had done the same without even realizing it. Look, I know this sounds crazy, a moonshiner becoming friends with Bigfoot. But here's the thing about the wilderness. It strips away all the bullshit. Out there, it doesn't matter who you are or what you believe. What matters is survival, and sometimes survival means finding allies in unexpected places. As winter set in, their routine adjusted. Moses visited less frequently, probably conserving energy during the cold months. But when he did come, he'd stay longer, sometimes sitting by Jake's fire for hours. Jake would talk about anything and everything. Told Moses about his ex-wife, about his kids who didn't speak to him anymore, about how he'd ended up running shine in the mountains. Moses would listen with this intense focus, occasionally making soft vocalizations that seemed like responses, not words, but emotional reactions. Sympathy when Jake talked about loss, amusement when Jake told funny stories, concern when Jake mentioned dangers. Moses understood tone, context, emotional subtext. This wasn't just an animal responding to sound patterns. This was genuine comprehension. One particularly cold night in January, the temperature dropped to -30. Jake's little camp stove couldn't keep up, and he was burning through firewood faster than usual. He was genuinely worried about freezing to death. His sleeping bag was rated for 0 degrees, but -30 was a whole different beast. The cold hurt to breathe. Every exposed inch of skin felt like it was being stabbed with needles. Then Moses appeared with an armload of wood that would have required 3 trips for Jake. But it wasn't just any wood. He'd brought fat wood, pine saturated with resin that burns hot and long. Moses knew exactly what Jake needed. He'd seen Jake struggling with the cold and understood what type of fuel would help most. Moses stacked the wood, then did something unprecedented. He sat down right next to Jake, his massive bulk blocking the wind. The heat radiating from his body was like sitting next to a furnace. Jake could feel warmth seeping through his coat, thawing his frozen muscles. They sat like that all night, Moses sheltering Jake from the killing cold, Jake feeding the fire that seemed to comfort them both. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. This was friendship in its purest form, one being helping another survive. In the morning, when the temperature had risen to merely brutal instead of lethal, Moses stood to leave. But before he did, he placed his hand on Jake's shoulder. The weight of it was staggering. Jake estimated Moses weighed at least 600 pounds, maybe more, but the touch was gentle. It was acknowledgement, gratitude maybe, or just connection. Then Moses was gone, leaving only tracks in the fresh snow and the memory of warmth. February brought new challenges. A rival moonshiner named Brandon Harris had been sniffing around the area, trying to locate Jake's still. He'd been undercutting Jake's prices in town, claiming he had a superior product and that Jake's operation was about to be shut down. Jake knew Brandon was looking for his site, planning to either steal his equipment or rat him out to the feds. Jake told Moses about Brandon during one of his visits, described what he looked like, what his truck sounded like, the danger he represented. Moses listened with unusual intensity, his eyes narrowing when Jake explained how Brandon had threatened other moonshiners in the past, sometimes violently. The guy was bad news, and everyone in the illegal liquor business knew it. 3 days later, Brandon showed up at Jake's camp while Jake was in the middle of a run. Jake couldn't shut down the still without ruining the batch, couldn't defend himself without abandoning expensive equipment. Brandon had timed it perfectly. He'd probably been watching Jake for days, learning his routine. Well, Brandon said, stepping into the clearing with a shotgun cradled in his arms. The famous Jake Miller. Nice setup you got here. Jake kept working, trying to stay calm. His own rifle was too far away to reach without making Brandon suspicious. "This is private property, Brandon. You're trespassing." Brandon laughed, an ugly sound that echoed off the rocks. "Ain't nobody's property out here, friend. Just wilderness and opportunity. I'm thinking you're going to have an accident. Stills blow up all the time. Real tragedy when it happens." He was moving closer, the shotgun now pointed vaguely in Jake's direction. Jake's mind raced, calculating distances. weighing options. None of them were good. Brandon had the advantage, and they both knew it. That's when they heard it, a roar that shook snow from the trees. Not like a bear or a mountain lion. Deeper, more primal, with an undertone of rage that made every hair on Jake's body stand up. It was a sound that reached back millions of years, tapping into ancient fears coded into human DNA. The sound of a predator, the sound of death. Brandon spun around, shotgun raised, just as Moses emerged from the forest. But this wasn't the gentle giant who shared Jake's fire. This was a territorial predator defending its domain. Moses stood at full height, arms spread wide, displaying his massive frame. He looked bigger than ever, his hair standing on end, his teeth bared. The roar came again, and Jake saw Brandon's hands shaking on the shotgun. "What the hell is that?" Brandon whispered, taking a step back. Moses advanced slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on the intruder. Brandon raised the shotgun, and Jake thought for sure he was going to fire. But Moses was smart. He grabbed a pine tree as thick as Jake's thigh and twisted. The crack of wood breaking was like a gunshot. The tree, 30 feet tall, came down between Moses and Brandon with a crash that shook the ground. Brandon dove backward to avoid being crushed, losing his grip on the shotgun. When Brandon scrambled to his feet, Moses was standing on the fallen tree, now eye level with the terrified Moonshiner despite being 20 feet away. The message was clear: leave or become part of the forest floor. Brandon ran, dropped his shotgun, and ran like the devil was chasing him. They heard his truck engine start 10 minutes later, tires spinning in the snow as he fled down the mountain. He never came back. Word got around that Jake's operation was protected by something unnatural, and the other shiners gave him a wide berth after that. Moses stayed visible until they were sure Brandon was gone, then approached Jake slowly. His posture shifted from aggressive to concerned, the transformation remarkable. He examined Jake carefully, checking for injuries, sniffing for the scent of fear or harm. When he was satisfied Jake was okay, he did something that broke Jake's heart a little. He hugged him. It wasn't a human hug exactly, more like an enveloping, where Moses wrapped his long arms around Jake and pulled him against his chest. Jake could hear his heartbeat, faster than expected, probably from the adrenaline of confrontation. They stood like that for maybe 10 seconds before Moses released him and stepped back. Jake tried to thank him, but how do you thank someone for saving your life without using words they can't understand? He just nodded and put his hand on Moses's arm. The hair was coarser than Jake expected, but the skin underneath was warm and surprisingly soft. Moses placed his massive hand over Jake's, engulfing it completely, and they stood there in silent understanding. Yeah. Jake Miller, hardened moonshiner who'd spent 8 years in the mountains avoiding the law, was having a moment with Bigfoot. Life's weird sometimes. Spring came late that year, but when it did, Moses changed his behavior again. He started bringing Jake gifts from the forest, not just firewood, but actual gifts. Interesting rocks, antler sheds, once a perfect eagle feather that must have taken him hours to find. He'd present each item formally, waiting for Jake's reaction before placing it carefully near his tent. Jake reciprocated with food, of course, but also started leaving other things for Moses. A steel knife to replace his stone tools, a tarp for his cave, a pair of work gloves that were comically small for Moses's hands, but which he seemed to treasure anyway. Moses would examine each gift thoroughly, turning it over in his hands, testing its properties, learning its purpose. The gloves fascinated him particularly. He understood their function immediately, but was intrigued by the stitching, running his fingers along the seams repeatedly. Within a week, Jake found a piece of deer hide near his camp that Moses had attempted to sew with plant fibers, creating a crude but functional pouch. Moses wasn't just using tools, he was reverse engineering them, learning manufacturing techniques from observation. Jake was watching evolution happen in real time. In May, Jake had to make an extended supply run to town. Usually, he was gone for 2 days maximum, but this time he needed to meet with distributors in Denver, meaning he'd be away for at least a week. He tried to explain this to Moses using a combination of gestures and props. 7 rocks for 7 days, pointing at the trail, then at himself, then walking his fingers away and back. Moses seemed agitated by this news, pacing back and forth, making low grumbling sounds. Jake thought Moses was worried, either for Jake's safety or about the disruption to their routine. Maybe both. Jake left extra food, enough for 2 weeks, and tried to reassure Moses he'd return. The trip took 9 days. Jake's truck broke down outside Laramie. Had to wait for parts. The whole time he worried about Moses. Had Moses thought Jake abandoned him? Would he still trust Jake when he returned? When Jake finally made it back to camp, the place was immaculate. The still had been cleaned, the copper polished to a shine. Firewood was stacked military neat. The ground around Jake's tent had been cleared of debris and small rocks. Moses had been taking care of Jake's space in his absence, maintaining it, protecting it. Moses appeared that first night back, but his approach was different, hesitant, almost shy. He sat farther away than usual, watching Jake with what could only be described as hurt feelings, like a dog whose owner had left for too long. Jake talked more that night than he had in months, explaining about the truck, the delay, showing Moses the new supplies he'd brought. Gradually, Moses moved closer, until by midnight, they were back to their usual positions by the fire. Jake had brought Moses something special from town, a chocolate bar, the good stuff with almonds. When Jake handed it to him, Moses' eyes went wide. He sniffed it carefully, then took the smallest possible bite. The expression on his face was pure joy. He savored that chocolate bar for an hour, making it last, closing his eyes with each piece like he was memorizing the experience. That's when Jake realized how lonely Moses' existence must be. Moses was the only one of his kind Jake had ever seen sign of. No other tracks but his. No other vocalizations in response to his calls. Moses was alone in these mountains, maybe alone in the world. Their friendship wasn't just convenience or mutual benefit. It was companionship for both of them. 2 outsiders who'd found understanding in the most unlikely place. Summer brought its own challenges. More hikers in the wilderness, increased federal patrols, and the constant worry of forest fires. Moses adapted to all of it with remarkable intelligence. He started ranging farther during his patrols, often bringing Jake news of approaching humans long before they could stumble upon the operation. Moses' warning system was sophisticated. Different knocks for different threats. 2 knocks meant hikers in the area but not approaching. 3 meant law enforcement. 1 long scraping sound meant immediate danger. He'd even developed a way to indicate direction and distance using combinations of sounds that Jake learned to interpret like Morse code. One afternoon in July, Jake heard the scraping sound followed by rapid knocks. He barely had time to cover the still before a Forest Service helicopter flew directly overhead. They were doing aerial surveillance, looking for illegal operations exactly like Jake's. Without Moses' warning, they would have caught Jake red-handed. Game over, prison time. The helicopter circled twice, but saw nothing suspicious. Just a camper with a tarp over his gear, completely normal for backcountry Wyoming. When it finally flew away, Moses emerged from the trees. He'd been watching the helicopter with intense focus, and Jake could see him processing this new information. Threats could come from above now, not just from the ground. Within days, Moses had adjusted their security accordingly. He started checking the sky regularly, learned the sound of distant helicopters, even figured out their patrol pattern. Moses understood scheduling, recognized that the flights came at regular intervals, and adjusted his visits to avoid them. But the most impressive display of Moses' intelligence came during the Bennett fire that August. Lightning strikes started ablaze about 10 miles north of Jake's position. The wind was pushing it south, straight toward his camp. Jake was preparing to evacuate, trying to figure out how to move or hide the still, when Moses appeared in full daylight, something he never did. Moses was agitated, gesturing frantically toward the east, not south where the fire was coming from, but east into terrain Jake had never explored. Rough country, dangerous country. Jake tried to explain that he needed to go west, toward the road, toward civilization. But Moses was insistent. He actually grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him eastward, with surprising gentleness for a creature that strong. If Moses had wanted, he could have yanked Jake's arm clean out of its socket. Jake had to make a choice: trust his own instincts and flee toward town, or follow Moses into unknown wilderness with a forest fire bearing down on them. The desperation in Moses' eyes made the decision for him. Jake grabbed his essential gear and followed. Moses led him through a maze of canyons and ridges Jake never knew existed. The route was treacherous but specific. Moses knew exactly where he was going, moving with confidence even as smoke began to fill the air. After 2 hours of hard hiking, Jake's lungs burning from exertion and smoke, Jake understood why Moses had chosen this direction. Moses had led him to a massive granite formation with a deep overhang, surrounded by a natural firebreak of bare rock. No fuel for the fire, no way for the flames to reach them. They sheltered there as the fire passed. The smoke was thick, the heat intense even at their distance, but the flames couldn't reach their position. Moses had known about this safe zone, had calculated wind direction and fire speed, had understood that west led to roads that would be clogged with evacuees and emergency vehicles. Moses had saved Jake's life with planning and foresight that most humans couldn't have managed. They stayed in that shelter for 2 days, while the fire burned itself out. Moses foraged for both of them, bringing water from a spring he knew about, finding edible plants Jake would never have recognized. When it was finally safe to return, Jake's camp was untouched. The fire had passed just a 1/4 mile to the north, stopped by a creak and shift in wind direction that Moses had somehow anticipated. The trust between them after that was absolute. Moses had risked exposure to save Jake, had shared survival knowledge that was clearly sacred to his existence, and Jake had followed him without question into what looked like certain death. They were bonded now in a way that transcended species. Fall arrived with its usual glory in the Rockies, aspens turning gold, crisp air, and the constant bugle of elk in rut. Moses' behavior shifted with the season. He became more active, ranging farther, staying out longer. Jake wondered if this was mating season for Moses' kind, if somewhere out there, another of his species was responding to ancient biological imperatives. But Moses always returned, usually with gifts from his travels. Once he brought Jake an obsidian arrowhead, perfectly crafted and obviously ancient. Another time, it was a chunk of turquoise the size of Jake's fist. Moses was sharing his discoveries, the treasures he found in his wanderings, trusting Jake with artifacts that might be sacred to his kind. Jake started teaching Moses things in return. Simple stuff at first. How to tie knots, how to sharpen the knife Jake had given him, how to read basic weather signs. Moses absorbed information like a sponge. Within days of showing him a bowline knot, Moses was creating complex hitches and lashings Jake had never seen before. The knife became Moses' prized possession. He fashioned a sheath from elk hide, wore it on a cord around his neck. He learned to maintain the edge, even figured out how to use Jake's whetstone properly after watching just once. The transformation in Moses' tool use was remarkable. His crafts became more refined, more precise. He was entering his own Stone Age revolution, jumping technological steps that took humans millennia. Jake was witnessing something extraordinary, the birth of a new tool using culture. October brought the first serious snow, and something else. Government scientists conducting some kind of environmental study. They set up a base camp about 3 miles from Jake's position with equipment Jake couldn't identify and purposes he could only guess at. Radio telemetry arrays, trail cameras everywhere, motion sensors, the works. Moses spotted them first, of course, and his agitation was unlike anything Jake had seen before. Moses paced constantly, made worried vocalizations, even struck trees in frustration. These weren't just threats to Jake's operation. They were threats to Moses himself. The scientists had trail cameras, motion sensors, equipment, that could detect and document Moses' existence. Moses understood this instinctively, recognized technology that could end his secretive life. If they captured clear evidence of him, Moses would become the most hunted being on the planet. Jake and Moses developed a plan together. Jake would create distractions, lead the scientists away from areas where Moses traveled. In return, Moses would help protect the still with even greater vigilance. It was risky for both of them, but necessary. The first part worked perfectly. Jake showed up at their camp occasionally, playing the friendly local, offering moonshine and conversation. They were geology grad students mostly, happy for the company and completely unaware of Jake's real purpose. Jake learned their survey patterns, their equipment limitations, where they'd placed their sensors. Moses, meanwhile, became a ghost. He learned the positions of every camera, the range of every sensor. He'd move through their grid like smoke, never triggering a single device. When he absolutely had to pass through monitored areas, he'd use deer and elk as cover, moving in their shadows, letting their heat signatures mask his own. But technology wasn't their only problem. One of the scientists, a woman named Dr. Rachel Martinez, was sharper than the others. She'd found tracks, analyzed hair samples that didn't match any known species, noticed patterns in the wildlife behavior that suggested an apex predator the databases couldn't identify. She started asking questions, pushing boundaries, getting closer to the truth. One evening, she followed Jake back toward his camp. Not obviously, but Jake had learned to spot surveillance from Moses. Dr. Martinez was good, professional even, but Moses was better. He led her on a wild chase without her ever knowing she was being redirected. Every time she'd get close to something significant, a convenient noise or movement would draw her attention elsewhere, a branch breaking here, an elk bugling there. Moses was manipulating her perception, controlling her investigation. After 3 hours of this, Dr. Martinez gave up and returned to camp. But Jake overheard her talking to her colleagues that night, and what she said chilled him. "There's something out here," she said. "Something intelligent, something that doesn't want to be found." The team packed up 2 weeks later, their study complete or abandoned. Jake never found out which, but they left behind equipment. Cameras still functional, solar panels still charging batteries. Evidence that could still capture Moses if left in place. Jake and Moses spent a day carefully removing every device, destroying the memory cards, ensuring no evidence remained. It was painstaking work, but necessary. They couldn't risk even one photo getting out. That night, Moses did something new. He vocalized in what seemed like language, not human language, but structured sounds, with repetition and rhythm that suggested meaning, patterns, syntax. He was trying to actually talk to Jake, to communicate complex ideas that gestures couldn't convey. Jake responded as best he could, mimicking Moses' sounds, trying to find patterns. They spent hours in this crude conversation, and while Jake never fully understood what Moses was trying to say, the effort itself was profound. Moses was attempting to bridge the gap between species with language, creating a pidgin that might, given time, become true communication. November was harsh that year. Early blizzards, temperatures that plummeted without warning. Jake was running low on supplies, but couldn't risk a town run with the weather so unpredictable. Moses noticed Jake rationing his food, saw him eating less, conserving fuel. Moses started hunting for Jake, not just bringing scraps or foraged plants, but actual fresh meat. A rabbit one day, a turkey the next, always cleaned and prepared, ready to cook. Moses had watched Jake enough to know what parts he ate, what he discarded. His provisioning was thoughtful, calculated to Jake's needs and preferences. But the most touching moment came during a whiteout that trapped Jake in his tent for 3 days. The wind was so fierce it threatened to tear the shelter apart, and Jake was genuinely scared, running out of water, nearly out of food, the cold seeping through every layer he had. On the second night, Jake heard digging outside. Moses was building a snow wall around his tent, creating a windbreak. He worked for hours in conditions that would have killed Jake in minutes. When the wall was complete, the difference was immediate. The wind still howled, but Jake's tent was stable, protected. Mose didn't leave. For 3 days, he stayed close, maintaining the wall, bringing Jake's snow to melt for water, even sharing his own body heat during the coldest hours. They weathered that storm together. And when it finally broke, when the sun came out and the world was transformed into crystalline beauty, they emerged as something more than friends. They were family. December brought new challenges and revelations. A documentary crew had heard rumors about unusual wildlife in the Wind River Range. They arrived with high-tech equipment, thermal drones, and a determination to find evidence of cryptids. This wasn't like the scientists who stumbled close to the truth. These people were actively hunting for Moses. The stress was visible in Moses's behavior. He paced constantly, made agitated vocalizations, even struck trees in frustration. The safe territory he'd known for who knows how long was being invaded by people specifically looking for him. Every instinct must have screamed at him to flee, to find new territory far from human intrusion. But Moses stayed. He stayed because Jake was there. Because leaving meant abandoning their connection. That loyalty humbled Jake. Here was a being who could vanish into the wilderness and never be found, choosing to remain in danger because of their friendship. They developed more sophisticated countermeasures. Jake monitored the documentary crew's radio chatter with a scanner he'd brought from town. Moses learned to recognize the sound of drones, could spot them against the sky, long before they could detect him. Together, they created false trails, fake evidence that led nowhere, a disinformation campaign that would have made intelligence agencies proud. The breakthrough came when Moses found their base camp while the crew was out filming. He didn't disturb anything, didn't leave obvious signs of intrusion, but he memorized their equipment, their routines, their weaknesses. That night, he drew patterns in the dirt outside Jake's tent, showing positions, blind spots, vulnerabilities. Together, they orchestrated a series of false sightings that led the crew progressively farther from both Jake's still and Moses's actual territory. Jake would leave subtle signs, broken branches, disturbed ground, that suggested movement in specific directions. Moses would create authentic-looking tracks that aged just right, appearing fresh enough to be exciting but old enough to suggest the creature had moved on. The crew spent 2 weeks chasing ghosts, getting increasingly frustrated as each promising lead dead-ended in empty wilderness. They finally gave up on Christmas Eve, packing their equipment and heading back to civilization with nothing but blurry footage of elk and bears. That Christmas, Jake cooked a real feast, used up most of his remaining supplies to make cornbread stuffing, venison stew, even a crude approximation of apple pie using dried fruit and honey. Moses arrived just as Jake was plating everything, drawn by smells that must have traveled for miles. They ate together in companionable silence, Moses trying each dish with careful consideration, Jake enjoying the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with a friend. When they finished, Jake gave Moses his Christmas present, a military surplus blanket, thick wool that would last decades. Moses examined it with wonder, running his hands over the tight weave, testing its warmth. Then he left, returning an hour later with his gift for Jake. It was a stone, but not just any stone. A geode, cracked open to reveal purple crystals that sparkled in the firelight. Moses had carried it, who knows how far, saved it for who knows how long, waiting for the right moment to share its beauty. Jake held that geode and realized something profound. Moses understood the concept of gifts, not just trading food for security, but actual gift-giving, the sharing of something beautiful simply because it might bring joy to another. That was culture. That was art. That was humanity. Or maybe humanity was the wrong word. Maybe what Jake was witnessing was something older, something that existed before humans invented words for it. Connection, love, family. January 2020 started with a federal raid that nearly ended everything. Someone had tipped them off. Probably Brandon Harris making one last attempt at revenge, still bitter about being run off by Moses months earlier. The feds came in force this time. ATF, Forest Service, even a DEA unit, helicopters, dogs, the works. This wasn't a routine check. This was a coordinated operation designed to shut Jake down permanently. Moses' warning gave Jake maybe 10 minutes. Not enough time to hide everything. Barely enough time to destroy the most incriminating evidence. Jake was pouring high-proof alcohol over his equipment, preparing to burn it all, when Moses did something unprecedented. He revealed himself to humans. Not directly, but strategically. Moses showed himself to the dog unit first. Just a glimpse through the trees, enough to send the dogs into a panic. German shepherds trained to face armed criminals ran yelping back to their handlers, tails between their legs, refusing to track despite commands and encouragement. Jake heard the handlers cursing, trying to calm their animals, confusion evident in their voices. Then Moses started breaking trees, big ones. The crack of trunks snapping echoed through the valley like artillery. The agents could hear something massive moving through the forest, getting closer, circling their position. They tried to maintain protocol, but Jake could see the fear in their movements from his hiding spot. Hands moving to weapons, voices getting higher, backs pressed together, everyone trying to watch all directions at once. The raid commander made the call to withdraw after one of his men claimed to see something bipedal and enormous moving between the trees. They retreated to their staging area, requested backup, started talking about possible bear attacks or unstable individuals in ghillie suits trying to scare them off. By the time they returned with reinforcements, Moses and Jake had erased every trace of the still. They'd worked through the night, Moses carrying equipment Jake could never have moved alone. Jake directing the concealment with desperate efficiency. When the sun rose, Jake's camp looked like nothing more than a wilderness shelter for an eccentric hermit. The agents searched for 2 days, found nothing actionable, left with warnings about federal land use and vague threats about surveillance. But Jake could see it in their eyes. They'd felt something in those woods, something that made them want to be anywhere else. Moses had weaponized their primal fears without ever directly confronting them. February brought a different kind of challenge. Jake got sick, really sick, some kind of respiratory infection that left him weak and feverish, every breath a struggle. In civilization, it would have meant antibiotics and bed rest. Out here, it might mean death. Moses knew something was wrong before Jake did. Started hovering, checking on Jake multiple times a day instead of his usual sporadic visits. When the fever really hit, when Jake could barely crawl out of his tent, Moses took over completely. He brought Jake water constantly, somehow understanding that hydration was crucial, maintained Jake's fire without being asked, even figured out how to use Jake's camp stove when the wood ran low. Most remarkably, he foraged for medicinal plants, bringing Jake pine needle tea and willow bark that actually helped with the fever and pain. For 3 days, Jake drifted in and out of consciousness, and every time he woke, Moses was there, watching, waiting, ready with water or food or just his presence. Moses would make soft rumbling sounds, almost like a cat's purr but deeper, more resonant. The sound was oddly comforting, gave Jake something to focus on besides the misery. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Jake woke clear-headed but weak as a kitten to find Moses asleep sitting up, leaning against a boulder near the tent. Moses had been keeping vigil for days, exhausting himself with constant care. When Moses woke and saw Jake sitting up, actually alert, the relief on his face was unmistakably human. He brought Jake soup, actual soup, that Moses had somehow made using Jake's pot and ingredients he'd gathered. It was good too, seasoned with wild herbs, rich with nutrients. They sat together while Jake ate, Moses watching every spoonful like a worried parent. Jake tried not to cry at the tenderness of this supposedly mythical creature, caring for him with such dedication. But some tears escaped anyway, and Moses gently wiped them away with one massive finger. That moment changed something fundamental between them. Jake had always known Moses was intelligent, but nursing him back to health required more than intelligence. It required compassion, empathy, the ability to recognize suffering in another being and feel compelled to alleviate it. Moses wasn't just smart, he was good. As Jake recovered over the following week, Moses brought him increasingly complex meals, stews with multiple ingredients, roasted meats seasoned with herbs Moses had clearly experimented with. Once, he even brought Jake what looked like primitive bread, some kind of ground seed mixed with water and cooked on hot rocks. It was dense and bland but edible, and the fact that Moses had figured out basic baking was mind-blowing. Jake's strength returned slowly. By mid-February, he was back to tending the still, though Moses watched him closely for signs of relapse. The creature had become protective to the point of being overbearing, insisting on carrying heavy loads and making worried sounds whenever Jake coughed. It was adorable, honestly, a 9-foot apex predator acting like an anxious mother. But Jake noticed something else too. Moses was changing, not physically, but behaviorally. He was spending more time at Jake's camp, sometimes staying for entire days. He'd started mimicking Jake's actions more deliberately, the way Jake organized his supplies, how he prepared food, even some of Jake's gestures and mannerisms. Moses was learning to be more human, or maybe Jake was learning to be more whatever Moses was. The line between them was blurring. One evening in late February, Moses did something that shocked Jake to his core. He spoke, not in English, obviously, but a clear, deliberate vocalization that was unmistakably attempting to form a word. Moses pointed at Jake, then made a sound that was somewhere between ake and ak. He was trying to say Jake's name. Jake's heart nearly stopped. He pointed at himself. "Jake," he said slowly. "Jake." Moses tried again. "Ya, ka." Close enough. Then Moses pointed at himself and made a different sound. A deep, resonant vocalization that Jake couldn't quite reproduce. But it was clearly Moses introducing himself, giving Jake his real name. Not the biblical nickname Jake had assigned, but his actual name. They spent the next hour like that, Moses attempting English words while Jake tried to learn Moses' language. It was crude, frustrating, and absolutely beautiful. Two species separated by millions of years of evolution, bridging the gap one mangled syllable at a time. By the end of the session, Moses could say Jake, food, fire, and something that sounded like friend. Jake could manage maybe 3 of Moses' sounds, though he suspected he was butchering the pronunciation. But they were communicating, really communicating. March brought warmer weather and a new problem. A team of anthropologists had gotten funding to investigate unexplained primate activity in the Rockies. Jake learned about it from a drunk professor at a bar in town, bragging about how he was going to prove Bigfoot was real and make millions off the discovery. Jake's blood ran cold. These weren't cryptid hunters or curious scientists. These were professionals with resources, expertise, and the backing of a major university. If they found Moses, it would be over. Moses would spend the rest of his life in a lab or a cage. Jake rushed back to camp, nearly killing himself on the mountain roads in his haste. He found Moses there, waiting as usual, and tried to explain the danger. Used drawings in the dirt, gestures, the limited shared vocabulary they'd developed. Showed Moses what capture would mean. Cages, tests, pain. Moses understood. The fear in his eyes was heartbreaking, but beneath the fear was something else. Determination. Moses looked at Jake, placed a hand on his shoulder, and made a sound they'd established meant stay. Moses wasn't running, wasn't leaving their territory. He was choosing to fight. The anthropologists arrived 2 weeks later. Dr. Chen was leading the expedition. Yes, the same Dr. Chen from the environmental study months earlier. She'd apparently convinced her colleagues that something significant was out here, and this time she had the resources to prove it. They set up a sophisticated base camp with equipment that made the previous studies look like amateur hour. Thermal imaging cameras with AI recognition software, a acoustic sensors that could detect and analyze vocalizations, even DNA analysis equipment for processing samples in the field. Thing is, Dr. Chen had learned from her previous visit. She knew someone was deliberately misleading her last time. She suspected Jake, though she had no proof. This time, she was prepared for interference. She'd brought security. 2 ex-military contractors, whose job was to make sure nobody tampered with the equipment or scared off the target. Jake and Moses were in trouble. They watched the camp from a distance, Moses hidden in the forest while Jake scouted openly, playing the curious local. Dr. Chen recognized him immediately. "Jake Miller," she said, not quite smiling. "Funny seeing you here. You seem to be around every time there's unusual wildlife activity in this area." Jake shrugged, playing it casual. "I live here. Kind of hard not to be around." "Uh-huh." Her eyes were sharp, calculating. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about the tracks we've been finding? 18-inch footprints. Bipedal gait. Estimated weight over 600 pounds. Bears get pretty big around here. These aren't bear tracks, and you know it." Dr. Chen stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Look, I don't know what your angle is. Maybe you're running some kind of tourist scam, making fake tracks to attract cryptid hunters. Maybe you're protecting something. But I've dedicated my career to this, and I'm not leaving until I have answers." Jake saw the conviction in her eyes. Dr. Chen wasn't going away. And unlike the others, she was smart enough and motivated enough to eventually succeed. He needed a different approach. "What would you do if you found it?" Jake asked. "Let's say there really is something out here. Something intelligent. What then?" Dr. Chen's expression shifted. "We'd document it. Study it. This would be the scientific discovery of the century. In a cage? In a protected habitat. We'd ensure its safety." "Bullshit." Jake's voice was hard. "You'd turn it into a circus. Media would swarm this place. Every government agency would want a piece. Trophy hunters would come from around the world. You'd destroy it, trying to save it." Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment. "You've seen it, haven't you? You know it's real." Jake didn't answer. Didn't need to. His silence said everything. "Help me understand," Dr. Chen said. "What is it? Where did it come from? Does it matter? Point is, it deserves to be left alone. The world deserves to know." "The world doesn't deserve shit," Jake interrupted. "The world would ruin this like it ruins everything. This creature has lived here for who knows how long, surviving, adapting, existing peacefully. And you want to drag it into the light for what? Fame? Grant money? Because you're curious?" Dr. Chen's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to expand human knowledge, to prove we're not alone. Don't you understand how important that is? I understand that some things are more important than human knowledge, like letting another intelligent being live in peace." They stared at each other, neither willing to back down. Finally, Dr. Chen spoke. "I'm sorry, Jake, but I have a job to do. Stay out of my way, or I'll have security remove you from the area." Jake left the camp knowing he'd made an enemy, but he'd also learned something important. Dr. Chen was motivated by discovery, not malice. Maybe, just maybe, that was something they could work with. That night, Jake and Moses held a council of war. Using their limited shared language and lots of drawings, they discussed options. Moses could leave, find new territory hundreds of miles away, but that meant abandoning the home he'd known, the caves and springs and hunting grounds that sustained him. It meant abandoning Jake. Moses refused. They could try to scare off the expedition again, but Dr. Chen was expecting that. She'd prepared for it. The security team was armed and wouldn't be frightened by broken trees and roaring. That left one option, an option so crazy Jake almost dismissed it out of hand. What if they controlled the discovery? The idea took shape over several days. What if, instead of hiding, Moses revealed himself, but on his terms, in a way that made him seem less like an animal to be studied and more like a person, a being with rights, with autonomy? It was risky as hell, but Jake couldn't see another way forward. The expeditions would keep coming. The technology would keep improving. Eventually, someone would get proof. Better to control the narrative than let it control them. Moses listened to Jake's plan, his expressive face showing concern, fear, but also something else. Hope, maybe, or trust. Moses had faced every challenge by Jake's side. He'd saved Jake's life multiple times. Now Jake was asking Moses to trust him with the biggest gamble of all. Moses agreed. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Jake would arrange a meeting between Moses and Dr. Chen. Not a capture, not an ambush, a meeting. Moses would demonstrate his intelligence, his tool use, his language attempts. Show Dr. Chen that he wasn't some animal to be caught and caged, but a sentient being deserving of protection and respect. If it worked, Dr. Chen might become an ally instead of a threat. She could help keep other researchers away, establish the area as protected habitat, buy Moses the safety he needed. If it failed, Moses would be captured or killed. Jake approached Dr. Chen 3 days later. She was examining data from her sensors when Jake walked into camp. The security contractors tensed, but Dr. Chen waved them off. "I'm surprised to see you," she said. "Thought you'd be busy sabotaging my equipment." "I want to make a deal," Jake said. Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening. I can give you what you want. Proof. Undeniable. Clear. Documented proof. But I have conditions." "What kind of conditions?" "You study it here, in its natural habitat. No capture. No tranquilizers. No attempts to control or confine it. You observe, document, and then you help protect it. Use your credentials to establish this area as protected land. Keep other researchers away. Give it the space it needs to exist." Dr. Chen stared at him. "You're serious? You can actually deliver proof." "Better than proof. I can arrange a meeting." "A meeting?" Dr. Chen's voice was flat. "You're saying this creature will willingly present itself for observation." "I'm saying it's intelligent enough to understand the stakes. And it's willing to try communication instead of constant hiding." Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Jake could see her mind working, weighing possibilities, calculating risks. Finally, she spoke. "If this is a trick, it's not. If you're wasting my time, I'm not." Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "Okay. When?" "Tomorrow night. Just you. No security, no weapons, no cameras. You earn its trust first. Then we talk about documentation." "No cameras?" Dr. Chen looked pained. "That's the whole point. You earn trust first," Jake repeated. "You get one chance at this. Don't screw it up." The next evening, Jake led Dr. Chen to a clearing about a mile from his camp. She'd followed his instructions, came alone, unarmed, though Jake suspected she had some kind of recording device hidden on her. He didn't blame her. This was her life's work. They waited as the sun set, the forest growing dark around them. Dr. Chen kept checking her watch, fidgeting with nervous energy. Jake remained still, knowing Moses was out there, watching, deciding if this was safe. Then Moses appeared. He didn't emerge dramatically or try to be intimidating. He simply stepped out of the tree line and stood there, clearly visible in the moonlight. 9 feet tall, covered in dark hair, unmistakably real and unmistakably not human. Dr. Chen gasped. Her hand went to her mouth, and Jake saw tears in her eyes. For all her professional detachment, this was still the moment she'd dreamed of her entire career. Proof. Validation. Discovery. Moses took a step forward, and Dr. Chen instinctively stepped back. Moses stopped, made a soft vocalization, and sat down, making himself smaller, less threatening. It was a deliberate, calculated action that showed remarkable social intelligence. "Holy shit," Dr. Chen whispered. "It's real. It's actually real." "He's real," Jake corrected. "Not it. He." Moses reached into a pouch he'd made from the deer hide, the one he'd sewn himself after learning from Jake's gloves. He pulled out several objects and laid them on the ground. The steel knife Jake had given him, A piece of rope with an intricate knot. The sewing project. Evidence of tool use and craftsmanship. Then Moses did something that made Dr. Chen's jaw drop. He pointed at Jake and said, "Jake, did he just say my name?" "Yeah. He's been learning English. I've been learning his language. We communicate." Dr. Chen sank to her knees, overwhelmed. "This changes everything. Do you understand? This changes everything. We thought we knew about evolution, intelligence, human origins, which is why he needs protection," Jake interrupted. "Not exploitation." Moses watched Dr. Chen carefully. Then he did something Jake hadn't expected. He pulled out the geode he'd given Jake for Christmas. Jake must have left it at camp, and Moses had brought it. Moses held it out to Dr. Chen like an offering. It was a gift. Moses was trying to establish relationship with her the same way he had with Jake. Through gifts, communication, trust. Dr. Chen took the geode with shaking hands. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice breaking. Then, looking at Moses, she added, "Thank you." Moses made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. They spent 2 hours in that clearing. Moses demonstrated more tool use, attempted more words, even drew simple pictures in the dirt. Dr. Chen asked questions, which Jake translated as best he could, and Moses answered through gestures and vocalizations. By the end, Dr. Chen was crying openly. "I've spent 20 years searching for this, and now that I've found it, I can't tell anyone. Because you're right, they'd destroy him, trying to study him. So you'll help?" Jake asked. Dr. Chen nodded. "I'll help. I'll use my grant to establish this area as critical habitat for an endangered species. Won't name what species, just that it requires protection. I'll publish papers about the need to preserve unknown biodiversity without revealing specifics, and I'll keep other researchers away." She looked at Moses. "But I want to keep studying you, if you'll let me. Not invasively, just observation, documentation for my own records. I promise I'll never publish anything that could expose you." Moses looked at Jake. Jake nodded. "Your choice, buddy." Moses considered for a long moment, then made a sound that Jake had learned, meant agreement. They had an alliance. Over the following months, Dr. Chen became a regular presence in the area. She'd visit weekly, spend time observing Moses from a respectful distance, sometimes joining Jake and Moses by the fire. She learned some of Moses's language, taught him more English. She documented everything in private journals she swore would never be published in her lifetime. More importantly, she made good on her promise. Using her academic credentials, she got the area designated as protected habitat, established regulations that kept commercial development and tourist activities out. She even negotiated with the Forest Service to limit their patrols in the area, citing sensitive environmental studies. Moses had official protection, even if the government didn't know what they were protecting. But the peace didn't last. In June, Brandon Harris returned. He'd been drinking, nursing his grudge, and had decided that if he couldn't have Jake's territory, nobody would. He came back with 3 friends, all armed, all mean drunks, looking for revenge. They found Jake's camp while Jake was in town for supplies. Found the still, which Jake had foolishly rebuilt after the federal raid. Found evidence of Jake's operation. And they waited. Moses found them first. Jake got the warning through Dr. Chen, who'd installed a basic radio system so they could communicate. "Jake, you need to get back here now. I'm seeing multiple heat signatures at your camp. Armed individuals." Jake's truck flew up that mountain road, but he knew he'd be too late. It was 40 minutes from town to his camp, and anything could happen in 40 minutes. When Jake arrived, his camp was a war zone, equipment smashed, tents shredded. And in the middle of it all, Brandon Harris and his friends, standing in a circle with rifles pointed outward. At Moses. Moses was bleeding from his shoulder, a graze from a bullet. He was backed against a boulder, cornered but defiant. The men were taunting him, working up the courage to kill him. "Look at this thing," Brandon crowed. "We're going to be famous. "Mount this freak's head right on the wall." Jake saw red. He jumped out of his truck, rifle in hand, and fired a shot into the air. "Get the hell away from him." Brandon spun, saw Jake, and laughed. Well, come to watch your pet die. Last warning, Brandon. Leave now, or this gets ugly. You're outnumbered, Jake. 4 guns against 1. You really want to die for an animal? He's not an animal. And you're not walking out of here if you hurt him. The standoff stretched. Jake could see Moses was hurt worse than the shoulder wound suggested. He was favoring his left leg, and there was blood on his face. These bastards had been shooting at him, possibly for a while. Then Dr. Chen's voice came from the forest. "Federal wildlife agents, drop your weapons." It was a bluff. Dr. Chen had no authority and no backup, but she'd grabbed some official-looking vest from her gear and was walking into the clearing with more confidence than she felt. Brandon's friends looked nervous. "Man, I ain't going to jail for this." "Shut up," Brandon snarled. But Jake could see the calculation in his eyes, could see him weighing the odds. Then Moses made a choice. He stood to his full height, despite his injuries, and roared. Not in aggression, but in warning. The sound shook the valley, echoing off the rocks, primal and terrifying. And this time, there were answers. Other roars from the forest. Multiple voices calling back. Moses wasn't alone. Jake's heart stopped. In all the time he'd known Moses, he'd never seen another of his kind, never heard another vocalization. But now, there they were. Moses' family, his people, answering his distress call. Brandon and his friends heard it too. Heard multiple creatures in the forest, all of them massive, all of them angry. The men broke, dropped their rifles, and ran for their truck, stumbling over each other in their panic. They were gone within seconds, tires squealing down the mountain road. The roaring stopped. The forest was silent. "Moses," Jake said softly, "are they real? Are there others?" Moses looked at Jake, and for the first time since they'd met, Jake saw sadness in his eyes. Moses shook his head, then pointed at his own throat. He'd been making all those sounds himself, throwing his voice, creating the illusion of multiple creatures to scare off the attackers. Moses had always been alone. Jake felt his heart break. Moses had protected them with a bluff, making Brandon think he had backup when really, he'd always been the last of his kind. The loneliness of that was staggering. Dr. Chen rushed to Moses, examining his wounds. "We need to clean these. The shoulder's not bad, but this leg wound is deep." They spent the next hour tending to Moses. Dr. Chen had medical supplies, and between her and Jake, they got him cleaned up and bandaged. Moses bore it stoically, though Jake could see the pain in his eyes. "I'm calling the sheriff about Brandon," Dr. Chen said. "He and his friends just committed multiple felonies." "No," Jake said. "You do that, you have to explain what they were shooting at. Opens too many questions. So they just get away with it?" "I'll handle Brandon," Jake said quietly. "My way." Dr. Chen looked like she wanted to argue, but didn't. She knew Jake's way probably involved methods the law wouldn't approve of. But sometimes, in the wilderness, old justice was the only justice that worked. Moses healed over the following weeks, but something had changed. The encounter with Brandon had reminded all of them how vulnerable Moses was. One lucky shot, and he'd be dead. One persistent hunter, and it would all be over. They needed a long-term solution. Dr. Chen came up with an idea. There are private wildlife reserves. Huge tracts of land, tens of thousands of acres, bought by conservation groups and kept wild. No hunting, no development, no human presence except caretakers. "You want to relocate him?" Jake asked. "I want to give him options. There's a reserve in Montana, almost 100,000 acres of untouched wilderness. If we could arrange access, Moses could live there without worrying about researchers or hunters or anyone else stumbling across him." Jake translated the idea to Moses as best he could, showed him maps, tried to explain the concept of protected land where he'd be truly safe. Moses looked at the maps, then at Jake, then at the mountains around them. This was his home. the only home he'd ever known. But Jake could see Moses thinking it through, weighing safety against familiarity. Finally, Moses made a sign they'd developed, a question mark gesture. Show? Moses said, the English word still clumsy in his mouth. Doctor Chen grinned. Yeah, we can show you. Road trip. And that's how Jake Miller, a moonshiner, Dr. Sarah Chen, an anthropologist, and Moses, the last Sasquatch, ended up on a completely illegal cross-state journey in the back of Jake's pickup truck with a modified camper shell. They traveled at night, Moses hidden under tarps. It took 3 days of careful driving, avoiding checkpoints and main roads. Moses bore it patiently, though Jake could see he was nervous. This was farther from home than Moses had ever been. The reserve was everything Dr. Chen had promised. Rolling wilderness, thick forests, mountains that stretched to the horizon, fresh streams, and abundant wildlife. Dr. Chen had arranged access through a conservation contact, who asked no questions. They hiked into the interior, Moses moving with increasing confidence as he explored. There were caves here too, similar to his home, good hunting grounds, fresh water, everything he needed. But when Dr. Chen suggested Moses could stay, Moses shook his head firmly. He pointed at Jake, then at the truck, then back toward Wyoming. Home. You don't want to stay? Dr. Chen asked, surprised. Moses made the sign for no, then pointed at Jake and said, friend, family. Jake's throat tightened. Buddy, this place is safer. You'd never have to worry about. Moses put a hand on Jake's shoulder, cutting him off. The meaning was clear. Safety didn't matter if it meant being alone. Moses had spent his whole life alone. He wasn't going back to that. He'd rather face danger with family than live safely in isolation. They returned to Wyoming together. But the trip hadn't been wasted. Moses had seen proof that safe places existed, that if things got too dangerous, he had options. That knowledge brought a certain peace. The summer passed quietly. Jake continued his operation, more carefully now. Moses continued his patrols and his visits. Dr. Chen continued her observations. They fell into a rhythm, the three of them, an unlikely family bound by secrets and trust. Jake taught Moses more English. Moses taught Jake more of his language. Dr. Chen documented it all, creating a dictionary of sorts that she locked away in a safe deposit box. For the future, she explained, maybe centuries from now, when humanity's less destructive, when we've learned to coexist with other intelligent species, these records will matter. Proof that we tried. Proof that understanding was possible. In August, something remarkable happened. Moses brought Jake a child's drawing, crude crayon on paper, clearly made by human hands. It showed a stick-figure family, 2 adults, 1 child, and something large and brown beside them. Written at the bottom in a child's handwriting, "Thank you for finding Daddy." Jake stared at it, confused. Moses, where did you get this? Moses gestured toward the mountains, making the sign for walk and find. You found someone lost. A family? Moses nodded. Dr. Chen helped investigate. Turned out a family had gotten separated while hiking 3 days ago. The father had fallen down a ravine, broken his leg. Search and rescue was looking, but the terrain was rough and the weather hadn't cooperated. Moses had found them, had brought them food and water, had even tried to splint the father's leg with sticks and vines. When search and rescue finally reached them, the father kept talking about a wild man who'd saved them. The story made local news, but nobody believed it, chalked it up to delirium from pain and dehydration. But the family knew. They'd left the drawing wedged in a tree near where Moses had found them, hoping somehow their rescuer would see it. Moses had retrieved it, and he kept it in his cave, Jake later discovered, placed carefully among his other precious possessions. The geode, the knife, the drawing, evidence that he mattered, that he'd made a difference. Fall arrived again, completing the cycle, a full year since Jake had first found Moses' tracks and started this strange journey. They celebrated with another feast, another exchange of gifts. Dr. Chen joined them, bringing expensive coffee and chocolate. They sat around the fire, the three of them, watching the stars emerge. Moses attempted to tell a story in his language, gesturing at the sky, making sounds that suggested he was describing constellations or maybe legends of his people, Jake and Dr. Chen didn't understand most of it, but they listened anyway, appreciating the effort. "You know what strikes me," Dr. Chen said later. "We spend so much time looking for intelligent life in space, sending signals into the cosmos. Meanwhile, there's intelligence right here on Earth that we ignore or try to destroy. Makes you think about what we'll do if we ever find aliens. Will we respect them, or will we treat them the way we've treated every other species on this planet?" "Maybe Moses' practice," Jake suggested. "Maybe learning to coexist with him teaches us something about coexisting with anyone who's different." Dr. Chen smiled. "That's surprisingly philosophical for a moonshiner. Y conten multitudes." Moses made a sound that might have been laughter. The documentary crew returned in October. New equipment, new determination, but this time, Dr. Chen was ready. She'd published a paper about an unidentified megafauna species possibly inhabiting the region, stressing that the area was too ecologically sensitive for human interference. Then she'd shared that paper with every conservation group, government agency, and environmental organization she could think of. The area was now under so much bureaucratic protection that the documentary crew couldn't get filming permits. They tried anyway, of course. But Jake, Dr. Chen, and Moses had become expert at misdirection. They led the crew on wild chases, created false evidence that pointed away from Moses' actual territory, even staged a discovery of old tracks that turned out to be an elaborate hoax by a local cryptid enthusiast, actually Jake in a costume. The crew left frustrated, convinced the whole thing was a myth perpetuated by locals who wanted attention. Moses was safe, for now. Winter came hard that year, the hardest Jake had experienced in his 8 years in the mountains. Temperatures regularly hit 40 below. Snow piled 10 feet deep. Supplies ran low, but they survived together. Moses bringing firewood and game, Jake sharing food and shelter. Dr. Chen checking on them both, making sure neither man nor creature faced the cold alone. They became something that had no name in human language. Not family in the traditional sense, but not friends either. Something deeper. Something that maybe Moses' people had a word for, but Jake and Dr. Chen didn't. They were survivors who'd chosen each other in a world that wanted to tear them apart. Jake still ran less and less. The money didn't matter as much anymore. He had enough saved, had enough of whatever he needed. The risk of continuing the operation now seemed foolish when he had so much to lose. In January, Jake dismantled the still for good. Packed up the copper coils, the condensers, all the equipment that had brought him to these mountains in the first place. Moses watched, curious, as Jake erased 8 years of illegal enterprise. "New chapter," Jake explained. "Time to do something different." Dr. Chen had an idea. The reserve in Montana needs a caretaker, someone to live on site, monitor wildlife, prevent poaching. It's remote, isolated, and the pay isn't great, but I'll take it, Jake said immediately. "You haven't heard the details. Don't need to. It's perfect." They moved in March, when the weather cleared. Jake's entire life fit in his truck. Moses traveled with them, hidden as before, but this time heading toward a new home instead of a temporary visit. The reserve was massive, 100,000 acres of wilderness, where Moses could roam freely without fear of discovery, where Jake could live legally for the first time in almost a decade, where Dr. Chen could visit without worrying about federal agents or documentary crews. Moses explored for days, learning every ridge and valley, every cave and stream. When he finally returned to the cabin where Jake was setting up his new life, Moses had something in his eyes that Jake had never seen before: peace. That first night in the new place, they sat on the cabin's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. Dr. Chen had brought wine to celebrate. Moses drank water from a steel cup Jake had given him, holding it carefully in his massive hands. To new beginnings, Dr. Chen toasted. To family, Jake added. Moses made a sound that encompassed both sentiments. They drank as the stars emerged, thousands of them visible in the dark sky far from any city lights. Moses pointed at constellations, naming them in his language, teaching Jake and Dr. Chen his people's names for the patterns humans called Orion and Ursa Major. Jake wondered how many generations of Moses's kind had looked at these same stars, telling the same stories. Wondered if Moses's ancestors had stood in these mountains 1,000 years ago, 10,000, watching the same sky and feeling the same wonder. All of that history, that culture, that knowledge, rested now in one being, the last of his kind, but maybe not the last of his story. Dr. Chen's hidden journals would preserve some of it. Jake's memories would keep Moses alive in his own way, and Moses himself, living freely in protected wilderness, was proof that coexistence was possible, that humans and other intelligent species could find common ground. It wasn't much, but it was something. As the night grew late and the temperature dropped, Moses stood to leave for his new cave. But he paused, looking at Jake and Dr. Chen, and said in clear English, "Thank you," 2 words, the hardest sounds for him to make. But he'd practiced, Jake realized. Had worked on this moment, preparing a gift of language to match all the gifts they'd given him. "You're welcome," Jake managed, his voice rough with emotion. Moses nodded once, then disappeared into the night. Silent as always, present as always. Jake and Dr. Chen sat in silence for a while after. Finally, Dr. Chen spoke. "Nobody will believe this happened." "Good," Jake said. "Let them not believe. Let them think Bigfoot is a myth while the reality lives safely in the wilderness. Sometimes the best protection is being thought impossible." "Still," Dr. Chen said, "it's a hell of a story." "Yeah," Jake agreed. "Yeah, it is." They finished their wine and watched the stars. 2 humans who'd learned that intelligence takes many forms. That family isn't defined by species. That sometimes the most profound connections happen in the unlikeliest circumstances. Out in the forest, Moses called once, a long musical vocalization that echoed through the valley, not a distress call or a warning, just a sound that meant, "I'm here, I'm alive, I'm home." Jake called back, a clumsy imitation of Moses's language that probably mangled the pronunciation. But Moses understood, called again, softer this time. A good night between friends. As the years went on, the story of Jake Miller and Moses became a routine. Jake worked as caretaker, keeping the reserve safe. Dr. Chen visited monthly, continuing her private documentation. Moses ranged across his territory, living as his people had lived for millennia, but with the added security of human protection. They aged together. Jake's hair turned gray. Dr. Chen earned tenure at her university, using her cryptic papers about protected megafauna to build a respected career. Moses grew slower, showed the signs of age that come to all living things, but their bond remained. Through harsh winters and beautiful summers, through challenges and celebrations, they remained connected. 3 beings who'd proven that intelligence, compassion, and friendship could bridge any gap. Jake never told anyone the full truth of what happened in those mountains. When people asked about his scars, his mysterious years running moonshine, his sudden career change, he'd just smile and say he'd found something more important than corn liquor. He'd found family in the wilderness. And that family had saved him in ways that had nothing to do with federal raids or rival shiners. It had saved him from loneliness, from isolation, from the idea that connection was impossible in a cruel world. Moses had taught Jake that intelligence isn't about language or tools or technology. It's about empathy, understanding, the willingness to reach across difference and say, "You matter, I see you. We're not so different after all." On quiet nights, when Jake sits on his porch watching the mountains, he sometimes hears Moses calling from the darkness, A reminder that some friendships transcend every barrier evolution can create, that some stories are too important to be bound by belief or skepticism. The last Sasquatch lives freely in the American wilderness, protected by humans, who learned that not every mystery needs to be solved. Some mysteries deserve to remain mysterious, preserved and protected, honored and respected. And somewhere in a safe deposit box, sealed until long after all three of them are gone, Dr. Chen's journals wait, a record of an impossible friendship, proof that once upon a time, in the Wind River Range, a moonshiner and a scientist befriended the last of a dying species. And that friendship changed everything. Not for the world, which remains skeptical and blind to magic living in its wild places, but for three individuals who learned that family has nothing to do with DNA and everything to do with choice, who learned that intelligence flourishes in forms we barely recognize, who learned that sometimes the greatest discoveries are the ones we choose to keep secret. Jake Miller sleeps soundly these days, no longer worried about federal raids or rival shiners. His dreams are filled with mountain peaks and firelight, with the sound of Moses' laughter and the taste of shared meals under starlit skies. And if sometimes he wakes to find fresh firewood stacked by his door, or a beautiful stone placed carefully on his porch, he smiles and says thank you to the darkness, to the friend who taught him that monsters are just people we haven't bothered to understand yet. The Wind River Range keeps its secrets. The Montana wilderness keeps its guardian. And three unlikely friends keep each other, bound by trust and affection and the kind of love that needs no words. Some stories end with answers. This one ends with mystery, and that's exactly how it should be.